Okay, in this video, we're going to differentiate max weighted hangs with a max effort pull. Notice the difference in the name already. Max, I didn't write it there, but weighted hangs, which is the maximum amount of weight you can add to your body to use a fingerboard with. Typical time frames are 5 seconds, 7 seconds, and the most common one that we're doing a video example for today is 10 seconds. And comparing that to what I would call a max effort pull, which is going to be relatively similar. However, you're going to be pulling at a perceived intensity, in this case, maximum intensity for that same time period. So I've broken down some of the similarities and the differences between these two that I'd like to go through and talk about the differences. So the first difference between those two types of training interventions are going to be the contraction type. When you hang on a fingerboard and you add weight to your body, the contraction type is more eccentric. So the 10-second max weighted hangs are more eccentric-like, meaning that you're grabbing onto something, trying to resist your fingers from opening up. When we are doing the max effort pull, we are pulling onto something downward, which is more concentric-like. Each type of muscle contraction has a little bit different of a maximum number, but it also will have a little bit different outcome, which we will talk about during the testing portion. The second thing that's different between them, or could be same but could be different, is how many sets of those interventions you do. When you use a weight fixed to your body and you're hanging on a fingerboard, we tend to utilize the opening of the hands as the failure point to define how many sets we do in an individual session. If we utilize the pulling version, I'm going to demonstrate that with the G-Strength 500, which I'm measuring the efforts at 10 seconds. I'm measuring the amount of force that I can produce. In that context, I can limit my set number by watching my force production capability. As soon as that force production goes down, then my sets are over. So we'll talk about the difference between those two and the outcomes of each intervention. When we talk about the failure point, that's also a bit more subjective when we refer to the max weighted hangs. How much you can tolerate is really hard to understand. Maybe you didn't rest enough, maybe you rested too much, etc. Your perception sometimes can be deceiving. We can negate a lot of that with the measurement device, where we can actually watch the force decline. Then we can guarantee that each individual session is at its own capacity or its own auto-regulated strength, and we can note when that strength declines. When referring to the similarities between these two interventions, similarity number one is the intensity. They're both really high intensity, which is great. They both will produce high levels of motor unit recruitment. They both will induce high levels of connective tissue loading. The eccentric version, or the weighted hangs, maybe a little bit more so in that context, but all in all, we can say they're both really good interventions for high intensity finger training for a rock climber. Number two is the time under tension. By utilizing that 7-second, 5-second, or 10-second time point, we're guaranteeing that we're getting highest levels of recruitment in that specific time frame. So with both interventions, we are guaranteed with a high level of motor unit recruitment because the time under tension is the same. When it comes to the edge size, as long as we're not modifying the edge, we can manipulate the edge up and down. With the demonstration in this video, we will use a 20mm edge, which is very customary when it comes to the 10-second weighted hang as the demo, but it could be done with any edge size. You want to make sure that an individual athlete, if it's yourself or one of your athletes, you're using an edge size that is a common edge size that they are using outside. That's going to give them the best bang for their buck. That's going to be the least likely to get them in any sort of injury. The very last one is grip position. I'm going to show the demonstration today with the half crimp, or even more importantly to note, the open crimp, because it's hard to get a half crimp fully with the pinky, but the grip position also is similar between these two interventions. We can utilize the same intervention, the same grip position with each intervention today. So now that we've covered the differences and similarities between these two training interventions, let's show a video of how we can actually identify what an estimated weight would look like. The more typical method that people are familiar with is slowly adding weight to that 20mm edge size over a series of sets with good rest between, finding that point to which they have a little bit of buffer of time at the end of their 10 seconds, or finding that period at which they're failing around that individual time point. The counter example that we're going to show that I utilize in my clinic with my athletes is we're going to use the G Strength 500 and we're going to pull for 10 seconds at max effort. With the portal application that I created, it's going to utilize the averages of those forces over 10 seconds, subtract the body weight, and it's going to estimate that load for you. So it's much more direct and faster methodology for doing it, but it's not the only way you can do it. That also is going to be the way that we would use the max effort pulls for the training intervention. To start with is test what our max hang weight would actually be. In order to do that really quickly, I'm going to use the G Strength 500 by Exergo, which is attached to the top of this 20mm edge tension board. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull as hard as I can for 10 seconds. And what the portal is going to do, the portal is going to take the forces, the average of all those forces, and divide it by my body weight to give me my estimated 10-second max weight hang. Then what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the load that it prescribes to do the 10-second weight hang. This is just a really simple way of estimating your load on top of your body weight for that particular training intervention. This is going to give me a 5-second countdown. So once I hit the 5 seconds countdown, I'm going to start pulling as hard as I can, and we're going to do that for 10 straight seconds. 4, 3, 2, as you can see, that's a pretty intense test for those of you that have not done it before. That puts my 10-second max weighted hang load at plus 75 pounds. Generally, when I do testing on individual athletes, I have them do multiple efforts just to make sure that on that particular day we're getting an accurate readout. Between those efforts, I would rest a couple minutes, making sure that they're fully recovered, making sure they can give a really try-hard effort. So as of today, I would say plus 75 pounds, it would be my 10-second weight. Okay, now we've calculated the maximum load that we should be able to hang. I'm going to overestimate that a little bit, simply to make the adding weight more simple for myself. So in this example, I'm going to use a 45-pound plate and a 35-pound plate, which is going to be 5 pounds greater than what the test showed. But another thing to point out, an important thing to point out, is the pulling is more of a concentric muscle action. When I do a max weighted hang in this example, it's going to be more like an eccentric. The other term for that is a yielding isometric. If those of you that are familiar with doing rehabilitation or any sort of strength conditioning realm, eccentric loads are greater than concentric loads. So I should be able to do more weight than the test actually shows. So make sure you go into doing this test with that understanding. What we're going to do is we're going to use the MK2 board by tension, and we're going to use a 20mm edge, and we're going to do a 10-second hang. As any of you know that have done these before, it's quite cumbersome in some cases. My load's not that heavy, but for people that's loads are over 100 pounds, it becomes quite tedious. So we're going to go 20mm edge, slowly lower into it, and go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Put our feet down. Then we're going to have one of the things that we've talked about already that's important now is trying to think about how many sets of 10-second max weighted hangs do we need to do until we see a strength loss. That's one of the things that makes using the max effort pull a bit more specific on any individual day, is it allows you to watch your force decline over time. By doing so, it gives us a bit more of an auto-regulation for every training session. Typically with the max weighted hang, we like to prescribe losing the half crimp position. My criticism with that is that's not really how I climb. I'm not really that worried about staying in that half crimp position when I'm on the climbing wall. But let me show you an example of what that would look like when you're sticking with a strict half crimp position. I'm gonna add the weight again. 80 pounds felt pretty appropriate. I could probably go a little heavier, but for the sake of our video today, probably not necessary. Let's see if we can stick with a half crimp. I'm gonna go over here and hang. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That one definitely felt harder, as you could tell by some of the shaking, but the thing that's weird is my pinky doesn't want to be in that same 90-degree position. So again, that's one of the things that I personally think is not that important when we're trying to do something that's really heavy, especially for those that have really short pinkies. They're gonna have a really hard time getting into that 90-degree position with the front 3 fingers, therefore adding a lot of weird rotation to those fingers, as maybe you can see in the video. Now let's zoom up on the G-Strength 500 portal to see what it looks like during that 10-second effort. This is the method in which I allow individuals to customize how many sets they do of an exercise based on how tired their muscles get. Eventually, you'll have sets where you can no longer sustain the same amount of force. In that context, that's when that particular finger training session could be over. So in addition to its ease of setup, which is just having something to pull against overhead, it also gives us the ability to auto-regulate how many sets we do in that session. Compare that to the max weighted hang, where we're using a loss of position in the fingers, which is a bit subjective, but also a subjective sense of fatigue. Not that those aren't useful, it's just a little bit different. So let's see what that looks like with a 10-second effort. Okay, now I'm all set up. What we're gonna do is enter the body weight, which I've already done right here, 165. This says right, but that's because it also has the ability to do right and left individual if you're doing training one arm at a time. But I'm gonna do it 2 arms at the same time. I'm gonna hit capture. It's gonna give me a 5-second countdown. Then I'm just gonna pull as hard as I can for 10 seconds. So let's see what that looks like. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and pull. As you can see, the line here maintained a little bit higher up into this 5-second time point. But essentially what we can do is over sets, we can do multiple sets and watch how much force we're actually producing, which is a real-time estimate as to how much muscle fatigue we're inducing during that exercise. If we scroll to the bottom through all the data, we can see that that one was a little bit less. That puts my estimated hang load around 70 pounds, so around 75, so 5 pounds less. So after doing a couple tests for the demo, a couple max weighted hangs for the demo, and a couple pulls, definitely seeing a force deficit in this context. So that's how you would use the 10-second max effort pull compared to the max 10-second weighted hang. You've seen some of the testing, now you've seen some of the training interventions. Now let's give a quick introduction to how and why you would use either of those during your training cycle. So number one I put on here is during your strength phase. Remember, the objective with a strength train, with the strength phase, is to make sure you're getting high levels of recruitment in the finger flexors. Another thing that's important to think about with the strength training phase is it's not very specific to climbing. So we use strength training phases knowing that it will reduce your performance just a little bit. That has everything to do with how the connective tissues are loaded and the timing that it takes with those interventions. So if we're going to be doing during a strength phase, we could use either one. Pick one that makes the most sense to you. Pick the one that you have access to the equipment for, which if you're in a normal gym, it's really easy to do a weighted hang. If you're on the road traveling, it's much more simple to do a max effort pull. In that context, you would probably want to do them 1 arm at a time unless you have something to put on top of your body weight. In that context, we would do them 1 side at a time. If it was in season it's okay to do a little bit of both, but I would suggest doing the max effort pull more importantly, because in that context, we want the volume of the strength training to be really low. The objective with any supplemental or supportive strength training in season is really just to remind the brain that it has access to all of those motor units. The majority of that work, however, should happen on the climbing wall, either outdoors or indoors, depending on your individual location or specific goals as an athlete. We want to make sure, though, that this is a very low percentage of the total things that you're doing. In a lot of contexts, we can say that power training or training that has more velocity should maintain that strength for a period of time. The last thing I put on here with a star is progress away from max effort stuff during the season, but then also we need to return to it at some point. And this essentially means after 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks of a performance phase, your ability to produce max effort will go down. That's totally normal, and that's not hard to bring back, but it requires more percentage of your time spent doing really heavy and slow things. So what you want to get out of this is not that one is better than the other, you just have options. Knowing the options can be really helpful because it can provide that little different stimulus that maybe you haven't had, or maybe you can still do some max effort stuff with less things to take away from this video. These are more similar than they are different. They're likely to produce a similar outcome. What you don't want to do is get married to one individual exercise methodology, assuming that it's going to continue to make progress. For any questions about these types of training interventions, contact Steve Bechtel at steve@climbstrong.com. This is the way.